So it's the confidence game. It's our book, and the quote that carries the chapter 4 is talking about ultimately anyone can be conned, if you have the balls to do it, anyone can be conned. And the more I read into Persuasion, reading Robert Cialdini's book, the more I believe that anybody can be conned. All it takes is to get someone uh at the right moment in time, and we all have shortcuts to the way we make decisions, that if someone gets us at that time, we could make a decision that looks right, but might just be the wrong one. So we need to be careful. Maybe that's what scriptures will say. Let him that thinketh is standeth take heed lest he falls. There's um, the three books we're reading in addition, to our main book talking about the topic, the big corn, the big corn, the act of the corn, and the markings. We've introduced those at different times. These are the additional three books we're reading just to talk about persuasion in this chapter 4, and so we're going to be talking about persuasion. And as we began this topic in chapter 2 of the book, we talked about the Putin. You are just talking about how the con game works. We talked about the Putin, and the Putin is pretty much really chapter 1. We talked about who the grifter is, who is the con man, and the victim we call the Mac. We talked about the put up, and the put up is just pretty much finding out about the victim and who is the victim, and getting the information of the victim to be able to then, you know, plan the right game, to be able to corner the victim. And that goes back to Sun Tzu's quote or principle that, if you're going to be guaranteed to win every warfare, you have to know the enemy just as much as you have to know yourself. You do know those two, then you're guaranteed victory in every battle. But if you have a lacking in one or both, then you're not guaranteed victory. So when a con person comes into this game, what is going to find out about the victim is audience, to be able to know how to be able to plan the right game to succeed. As much as that is a negative part of it, again, we can use it positively. If I'm going to be giving a talk, uh, a sales speech, marketing, engagement to any audience, I need to know about my audience, so as to be able to know how best, to align my words, my message in a way that there will be understanding, there will be communication. One of the greatest deterrent to communication that I would say is the assumption that when we think that communication has taken place, whereas communication has not taken place, then that's one of the greatest hindrance, obstacles to communication. We assume or would suppose that we have communicated, whereas the person has no clue what we're talking about. There's that uh, famous quote that would say that the message that I prepared, to give is different from the message that I gave, which is different from the message that people received. Because again, we'll say that the biggest part of communication is not verbal. Right. I might be saying all the things I want to say, doesn't mean that people are receiving it, because they're not just listening to me, they're watching me. Right, they're watching me. And like we say in the hierarchy of communication, what a person sees is higher than what a person hears. So no, most of what we communicate is our gesticulation, our appearance, our dressing, our courage, what a person hears from what he sees about us, or imagines about us is higher than what the person is actually hearing, so the message, if what we're saying is not well aligned to what our appearance, our gesticulations, our attitude, our courage, then there's a confusion. And what the person is really hearing is what the person is seeing, not what you are saying, right? So all of those are important. So it's good to know all of these, that you're knowing your audience, you're knowing yourself, and you're planning and aligning both in such a way that the message is well passed along, right? So the next thing we see in the Ken game is a play, which is pretty much introducing, the plays, the next one, and that was we talked about that in chapter 3. And that's pretty much introducing, the game to the victim, beginning to set the victim up for the play, for the game, begin to play, that initial introduction to the victim or to the in chapter 4, where we have right now is the rope, which is pretty much the convincing the mark, roping the mark in, and all of this is it's an analogy to when you fish, you bait you bait the victim, make the victim to be attracted, right? So you know what's the bait to the victim, and you use that bait to attract the victim. But behind that bait is a hook, and you need the victim to bite, right? And when the victim bites, then you can hook the person in, and then you can then pull or rope the person into the game, so all that's the analogy we're looking at here, so it's knowing about the victim, beginning to introduce or set the play, for the game, could be a con game. Like I say again, we need not to be too carried away with just a con game. This is something that affects every area of our life. For my time here with you all to do this, I need to, understand you all, and also set this in a way that will be a blessing, to you all, right? And the rope is pretty much the convincing, or the actual, the convincing, the engagement, with the with the victim or the audience, right? And here we've talked about negotiating, which is a form of communication, or engagement with the audience, and today we're further on still talking about the convincing, the roping in. We're going to be talking about persuasion, just another part here in the rope, so simply, just as the uh, uh figurative word might be, to rope is to persuade, to convince, or to appeal, or to negotiate, and that's what we've talked about negotiation earlier on. And here we're going to be talking about persuasion, so figuratively, it just means to bind, to fasten, to tie, or a rope, or with a rope or cord, to as it were, um and wrap, the audience with what you're trying to sell. And the tail is pretty much the final sell. We're talking about that in chapter 5. That's what we come up with in chapter 5, talking about the tail. So we've talked about negotiation here. We're talking about persuasion, just different ways of still doing the same thing. Negotiation is a two-way process. When we do negotiation, it's more like a two-way process, or on reaching a mutual agreement, through concessions and trade-offs, right? You concede some things, you trade some things off, whereas persuasion is not too much of a two-way. It's persuasion is generally a one-sided, aiming to influence, change beliefs, or move someone to action through logic or emotion. It's typically a one-sided as against negotiation, where we come to the table. Persuasion is more like what I'm doing here. It's more like a teaching, a preaching, a sales speech, you know. Two of them could be mixed together because, yeah, as we do this, we're open uh, to discussions, questions and answers, but really we're not really selling, well, we're selling in a sense, but there's that overlap between negotiation and persuasion, but really more often than not, negotiation is a two-way process, there's a continual uh front and back to get to a common ground, whereas persuasion, is more like a one-sided, where someone is selling a point or selling a product or selling an idea, to other people. So negotiation requires both sides to give up something, while persuasion seeks to convince someone to adopt a position, right? So key difference between negotiation and persuasion, one is the process by which it takes place. Negotiation is a structured give and take involving at minimum a two-way exchange, right? That's a two-way exchange. Persuasion is often a one-way attempt to shift another party's mindset by you're the one talking. Outcome, also the outcome goal. The goal of negotiation is a mutually satisfactory agreement, often involving compromise. The goal of persuasion is to have the other party see things your way, and that persuasion is more like it, when it comes to a con game, because it's a grifter trying to move the mark, to his position. It's more persuasion than negotiation, when it comes to the con game and comes to selling, and political, maybe well, not even the most most things actually is persuasion, but there are places for negotiation where um there are places for negotiation where uh, there's a partnership, or wanting to do things as a partnership, uh, or working together. There are places for both of them, but they're not exactly the same in terms of the way it's done and the outcome. Also, there's a difference in the mechanism on which they operate, right? Negotiators exchange concessions, right? They trade value. Persuaders, provide reasons, logic, and emotional appeal. Yeah, also in the nature, negotiation is often viewed as a strategic or tactical, right? Persuasion is often psychological and emotional, right? And also in the relationship, um, persuasion can be used within a negotiation to help reach a compromise. Yeah, yeah. So you can use persuasion in while you're negotiating to help the person see your point, So, yeah, just looking at the differences between the two of them. So, looking at synonyms for each of them, synonyms for negotiation include bargaining, when you're bargaining for something, compromise, when you're dealing, mediation, closing, transactional dialogue. That's what negotiation is. You're doing a transaction. On the other side, persuasion, the synonyms for it include you're influencing somebody, you're convincing somebody, you're persuading something, you're shifting someone, so it's also you're urging someone, you're guiding someone. Those are synonyms for persuasion.